The gavel struck the mahogany bench with the finality of a coffin nail. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the suffocating silence of courtroom 3B like a blade through flesh. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Marcus Williams felt his knees buckle. At 17, the word life had never carried such crushing weight. The shackles around his wrists suddenly felt heavier, the orange jumpsuit tighter against his chest as his breathing became shallow, desperate. This couldn't be real. 3 months ago, he was worried about calculus tests and college applications. Now he was staring down a corridor that stretched into darkness with no end. The courtroom erupted in gasps and muffled sobs. Marcus's mother collapsed into her sister's arms, her wails piercing the air like sirens. But Marcus couldn't turn around. He couldn't face them. Not now. Your Honor, this is unconscionable. His public defender stammered, her voice cracking. The defendant is a minor with no prior record. The court has spoken, Counselor. Judge Harrison's cold eyes never left Marcus. The severity of armed robbery demands the full extent of the law. Armed robbery. The words tasted like poison in Marcus's mouth. He'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, walking home from basketball practice when police surrounded him 3 blocks from a convenience store holdup. No weapon found on him. No fingerprints at the scene. Just the word of a store clerk who said the robber looked like him, and security footage too grainy to make out a face. In the gallery, Zara Richardson sat frozen, her dark eyes wide with disbelief. Her hands gripped the wooden bench until her knuckles turned white. She watched the boy she loved, the boy who helped her with chemistry homework and made her laugh until her sides hurt, being led away in chains like a dangerous criminal. The injustice burned in her throat like acid. She'd researched the cases, stayed up nights reading court documents. White defendants convicted of similar crimes in this very courthouse. Probation, community service, maximum sentences of 8 to 10 years. But Marcus, brilliant, gentle Marcus, was being buried alive. Her phone felt like lead in her trembling hands as she scrolled to a contact she'd never thought she'd use for something like this. The weight of what she was about to do pressed against her chest, making it hard to breathe. She had to make the call that could change everything. The courthouse bathroom's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps as Zara locked herself in the furthest stall. Her hands shook so violently she could barely hold her phone steady. The cold tile walls seemed to close in around her as she scrolled to Dad in her contacts, her thumb hovering over the call button. She'd never told him about Marcus. How could she? David Richardson, the first Black attorney general in the nation's history, had built his career on being untouchable, uncompromising. The man who'd prosecuted corrupt politicians and dismantled organized crime rings couldn't know his daughter was dating a boy from the projects. Especially not now, when that boy had just been branded a criminal by the very system her father represented. The phone rang once, twice. Zara? Sweetheart, aren't you supposed to be in class? His voice was warm, distracted. She could hear papers shuffling in the background, the distant hum of his office in the Justice Department. For a moment, she almost hung up, almost pretended this nightmare wasn't happening. Daddy, I need you to listen to me. Her voice cracked like thin ice. Really listen. The shuffling stopped. David Richardson had learned to read his daughter's moods through phone calls across 3 time zones during her years at Georgetown. This wasn't about grades or money or boy trouble. This was something else entirely. What's wrong, baby girl? There's a boy, Marcus Williams. He just got sentenced to life in prison for armed robbery. The words tumbled out in a rush. But Daddy, he didn't do it. The evidence is circumstantial at best, and Judge Harrison. Zara, slow down. Why are you calling me about some random case? The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Zara closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything she'd kept hidden pressing down on her chest. Because I love him. David's sharp intake of breath echoed through the phone. 27 years of climbing the political ladder, of being twice as good to get half as far, of carefully crafting his image as the unshakable guardian of justice. And his daughter had just shattered it all with 4 words. You love him, he repeated slowly, his prosecutor's mind already calculating the implications. For 8 months. And before you say anything, he's not what you think. He's pre-med, Dad. full scholarship to Howard next year. He volunteers at the community center, tutors kids in math. Her voice grew stronger with each word. He's everything you raised me to value in a person. David sank into his leather chair, staring out at the Washington skyline. His daughter, his brilliant principal daughter, had fallen in love with a boy the system had just labeled a violent criminal. The irony wasn't lost on him. Zara, I can't just… Daddy, they're trying to destroy him. The desperation in her voice cut through his political calculations like a knife. Judge Harrison gave him life without parole. Life, for a crime that usually gets probation when the defendant looks like me. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of everything they both knew but rarely spoke about. David had spent his career navigating the treacherous waters of being a black man in power, always aware that one misstep could confirm every stereotype his enemies whispered behind closed doors. "I'll look into it," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "This isn't just about Marcus." Zara's voice was fierce now, urgent. "This is about a system that's broken, and you're one of the few people with the power to fix it." The case file landed on David Richardson's mahogany desk with a hollow thud at 11:47 p.m. His corner office in the Justice Department was bathed in the amber glow of his desk lamp, the Washington Monument visible through floor-to-ceiling windows like a silent sentinel in the darkness. He'd sent his staff home hours ago, claiming he needed to catch up on paperwork. The truth was more complicated. People versus Marcus Williams. The manila folder felt heavier than it should have as David opened it with the careful precision of a surgeon making the first incision. Inside, the evidence was disturbingly thin. Witness testimony from a convenience store clerk who admitted the lighting was poor, grainy security footage that could have been anyone, and Marcus's presence 3 blocks away 20 minutes after the robbery. In David's early days as a prosecutor, this case would have been plea bargained down to a misdemeanor. But that was before he understood how the system really worked. The memories came flooding back unbidden. His own arrest at 19 during a peaceful protest, the way the officers had slammed him against the squad car while calling him boy and worse. Even then, with his acceptance letter to Harvard Law School in his back pocket, he'd been just another black face to them. The humiliation had burned like acid in his throat, but it had also forged something unbreakable inside him. The determination to climb so high that no one could ever look down on him again. 28 years later, he sat in the highest law enforcement office in the land, and his daughter was begging him to save a boy who looked exactly like he had at 17. David pulled up Judge Harrison's sentencing records on his computer, the blue glow of the screen casting shadows across his weathered face. The pattern emerged like a disease under a microscope, systematic, deliberate, devastating. Black defendants. Average sentence 8.3 years for armed robbery. White defendants, 3.1 years for identical charges. The numbers didn't lie even when the system did. Across town, Zara sat in the sterile visiting room of the county jail, her hands pressed against the bulletproof glass that separated her from Marcus. The orange jumpsuit made him look smaller somehow, younger. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually perfect posture had collapsed into something defeated. "They're moving me to state prison tomorrow," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper through the phone. "Zara, I can't do this. Life in prison. I'll never see you graduate. Never walk you down the aisle, never." "Stop!" Her voice was fierce, cutting through his despair like a blade. "Don't you dare give up on us. On yourself. Look around, baby. Look where we are." Marcus gestured weakly at the concrete walls, the guards watching their every move. "This is what loving me gets you. Visiting rooms and collect calls and… This is what a broken system gets us," Zara interrupted, leaning forward until her breath fogged the glass. "But systems can be fixed. People can be held accountable." Marcus studied her face, seeing something there he'd never noticed before. A steel resolve that reminded him of the civil rights leaders he'd studied in history class. "What aren't you telling me? My father is looking into your case." The words hung between them like a lifeline thrown into churning waters. Marcus knew about her father, of course, everyone did. The Attorney General's daughter dating a kid from the projects would have been scandal enough without adding a wrongful conviction to the mix. Zara, you can't ask him to risk his career for me. I'm not asking him to risk anything. Her eyes blazed with conviction. I'm asking him to do his job. Back in his office, David closed the case file and reached for his phone. The weight of his badge, his oath, and his daughter's tears pressed down on him like a physical force. He'd spent decades learning to navigate the system, to work within its constraints, to pick his battles carefully. But some battles chose you. The phone call came at 6 a.m., jarring David from restless sleep. Senator Patricia Hawkins's voice was ice-cold through the receiver. David, we need to talk. My office. 1 hour. The line went dead before he could respond. David stared at his phone in the pre-dawn darkness, knowing exactly what this was about. Word traveled fast in Washington, especially when the Attorney General started asking uncomfortable questions about judicial patterns in a conservative district. An hour later, he sat across from Senator Hawkins in her Capitol Hill office, the morning sun casting long shadows across her mahogany desk. Her steel-gray hair was pulled back in a severe bun, her expression equally unforgiving. Judge Harrison is a family friend, David. A good man who's served this country for 30 years. Good men don't systematically sentence black defendants to triple the time of white defendants for identical crimes, David replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. You're playing with fire. Hawkins leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Your confirmation hearings were contentious enough. Do you really want to give your enemies ammunition? The threat hung in the air like smoke. David had fought too hard to reach this office to throw it away lightly. But as he thought of Marcus Williams rotting in a cell for a crime built on shadows and prejudice, he felt something shift inside him. A line being drawn that he couldn't uncross. That afternoon, David found himself in a cramped community center in Southeast D.C., surrounded by faces that told stories of systemic injustice. Reverend Sarah Johnson, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, spread case files across a folding table like evidence at a crime scene. We've been tracking Judge Harrison's patterns for 8 years, she said, her voice carrying the weight of countless battles fought and lost. 43 cases where black defendants received sentences averaging 300% longer than white defendants for comparable crimes. Beside her, Miguel Santos, a young Latino lawyer with fire in his eyes and ink stains on his fingers from late-night research sessions, pulled up spreadsheets on his laptop. It's not just Harrison. District Attorney Morrison, Detective Captain Walsh, they're all part of the same machine. A machine designed to feed black and brown bodies into the prison system, Reverend Johnson added, her words cutting through the stale air of the community center like a prayer and an accusation rolled into one. David studied the faces around the table, mothers who'd lost sons to excessive sentences, fathers who'd watched their children disappear into a system that saw them as statistics rather than human beings. These weren't abstract cases anymore. They were Zara's Marcus, multiplied by dozens. Meanwhile, across town at Georgetown University, Zara stood before a crowd of 200 students in the campus quad. Her voice carried across the autumn air, amplified by a borrowed megaphone and fueled by righteous anger. Marcus Williams is not just one case, she declared, her words echoing off the brick buildings. He's the face of a system that sees young black men as guilty until proven innocent, and sometimes not even then. The crowd erupted in cheers and chants, but Zara felt the weight of what she was risking. Her father's career, her own future, the comfortable life she'd always known. All of it balanced on the edge of a knife. Back in the community center, David's phone buzzed with a text from his chief of staff. 3 more senators called. They want you to back off. He looked up at Reverend Johnson, who was watching him with knowing eyes. The question isn't whether you can afford to fight this battle, Mr. Attorney General, she said quietly. The question is whether you can afford not to. The press conference announcement hit the airwaves at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday that would change everything. David stood behind the Justice Department podium, the weight of federal authority and personal conviction converging in his voice as he spoke the words that would either define his legacy or destroy it. Today, The Department of Justice is launching a comprehensive civil rights investigation into systemic sentencing disparities in the Eastern District Court. The room erupted. Cameras flashed like lightning strikes. Reporters shouted questions over each other, and David felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He'd crossed the Rubicon, and there was no going back. Within hours, the political machinery of Washington turned its full fury on him. Fox News ran a cheerin' reading, Attorney General's conflict of interest, while cable pundits dissected his motives with surgical precision. The narrative was already being written. David Richardson, the once untouchable Attorney General, had compromised his objectivity for his daughter's boyfriend. That evening, David sat in his Georgetown home's kitchen, the familiar warmth of the space feeling foreign under the weight of what he'd unleashed. Elena Richardson moved around the granite island with practiced grace, her silver hair catching the pendant lights as she prepared dinner with mechanical precision. 25 years of marriage had taught her to read her husband's moods in the set of his shoulders, the way he held his coffee cup. "The president called," she said without looking up from the vegetables she was chopping. "Twice." "I know. Senator Morrison wants a meeting tomorrow. So does the Judiciary Committee chair." Her knife work was precise, controlled, the same way she'd handled every political crisis in their marriage. "They're circling, David." He watched his wife's hands, steady and sure, and wondered when they'd stopped reaching for his during moments like this. "Elena, I need you to understand." "I understand perfectly." She finally looked at him, her dark eyes reflecting decades of political calculations and personal sacrifices. "You're willing to throw away everything we've built for a boy you've never met." "I'm willing to do my job." "Your job is to serve the people, not chase windmills because our daughter fell in love with the wrong boy." The words hung between them like a blade. David felt something crack inside his chest, not just at her words, but at the realization that the woman he'd loved for a quarter-century saw Marcus Williams as the wrong boy, simply because of where he came from. 300 miles away, Marcus pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of his cell, his ribs screaming from the accidental collision with a guard's baton during the morning count. Word had spread through the prison like wildfire, the Attorney General's investigation, the connection to the kid in cell block D. The guard's message was clear. Some fights weren't worth fighting. "You think you're special now, Williams?" Officer Brennan had whispered as he'd shoved Marcus against the wall. "Think daddy government's gonna save you? You're still just another number in here." But Marcus wasn't thinking about the pain or the threats. He was thinking about Zara's voice during their last phone call, the steel in her words when she told him about the families coming forward, the students organizing, the momentum building. For the first time since his sentencing, he felt something other than despair. Hope, fragile and dangerous as a flame in the wind. Back in Washington, Zara stood in the law library at Georgetown, surrounded by case files and legal briefs that painted a picture of systemic injustice spanning decades. Around her, a diverse group of students worked with the focused intensity of people who understood that justice wasn't just an abstract concept. It was personal. "We've got 12 more families willing to go on record," announced Jessica Chin, a pre-law student whose own brother had been caught in the system's web, all with similar patterns of excessive sentencing. Zara looked up from the brief she was reviewing, her eyes burning from hours of reading but her resolve stronger than ever. "Then we make sure their voices are heard." The cost of truth was becoming clear: careers, relationships, safety, comfort. But as David stared at his reflection in his kitchen window, seeing his father's face looking back at him, he knew some prices were worth paying. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Back off, or your daughter pays the price." The war had begun. The federal courthouse in downtown D.C. had never seen anything like it. Families streamed through the marble corridors like a river of suppressed grief finally finding its voice. They came carrying manila folders stuffed with court documents, faded photographs of sons and daughters, and stories that had been buried under the weight of a system designed to silence them. Dorothy Washington clutched her husband's arm as they approached the witness table, her Sunday best pressed and perfect despite the tremor in her hands. At 62, she'd spent the last 8 years visiting her son Jerome through bulletproof glass, watching him age behind bars for a drug possession charge that had earned 3 white college students probation the same month. Jerome was pre-med at Howard, she testified, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. 15 years for 2 grams of marijuana. The judge said he needed to send a message to his community. David watched from the back of the room as family after family stepped forward, each story a damning indictment of the system he'd sworn to uphold. The Washingtons, the Garcias, the Johnsons. A tapestry of broken dreams woven together by judicial bias so systematic it took his breath away. The evidence was overwhelming now. FBI agents had uncovered email chains between Judge Harrison and District Attorney Morrison discussing urban crime initiatives and deterrent sentencing for certain demographics. The language was coded, careful, but the intent was crystal clear. That evening, David's phone rang as he reviewed testimony transcripts in his home office. The caller ID made his stomach clench. Chief of Staff to the President. David, the President wants to see you. Tomorrow, 2 p.m. The Oval Office felt smaller than David remembered, the weight of history pressing down from every corner. President Williams sat behind the resolute desk, his expression unreadable as he gestured for David to take a seat. You've caused quite a stir, David. I've done my job, Mr. President. Your job is to serve this administration's interests. The president leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. Justice Brennan is retiring next month. The Supreme Court nomination could be yours, if you show the wisdom to know when a fight isn't worth fighting. The offer hung in the air like a golden chain. Everything David had worked for, dreamed of, sacrificed for, handed to him on a silver platter. All he had to do was walk away from Marcus Williams and the dozens of families whose voices were finally being heard. Meanwhile, in her dorm room at Georgetown, Zara read Marcus's latest letter by lamplight, her fingers tracing the careful script that had become her lifeline. Baby, I know this is hard on you and your family. If you need to walk away, I'll understand. But watching these families come forward, seeing their courage, it's given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. She pressed the letter to her chest, feeling the weight of his words and the strength they gave her. Their love had become something bigger than themselves, a symbol of resistance against a system that sought to divide and destroy. The next morning brought news that would change everything. FBI raids on Judge Harrison's chambers had uncovered a safe containing $200,000 in cash and detailed records of a pay-for-sentencing scheme that reached into the highest levels of the state judiciary. David stared at the evidence spread across his desk, knowing that the point of no return was no longer ahead of him. It was behind him, and there was no going back. His phone buzzed with a text from Zara. Dad, whatever they're offering you, remember that some things are worth more than power. The final battle was about to begin. The handcuffs clicked around Judge Harrison's wrists with the same finality his gavel had once carried. Federal agents led him through the courthouse corridors where he'd dispensed his twisted version of justice for 3 decades, past the portraits of legal luminaries who seemed to watch in silent judgment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd sent countless young black men to prison was now facing the same fate. District Attorney Morrison followed 20 minutes later, his expensive suit wrinkled and his face ashen as reporters shouted questions about the corruption scheme that had destroyed dozens of lives for profit. The FBI had found everything: bank records, coded communications, a systematic conspiracy to inflate sentences based on race and class. 8 months after his conviction, Marcus Williams walked out of state prison into the blinding afternoon sun, his legs unsteady after so long behind concrete walls. The world felt too bright, too loud, too open. Zara waited by the gate, her face a mixture of joy and heartbreak, as she watched the boy she loved struggle to remember how to be free. Hey, beautiful, Marcus whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse and emotion. She ran to him, her arms wrapping around his too-thin frame as if she could hold all his broken pieces together. He smelled like industrial soap and desperation, but underneath it all, he was still her Marcus. I'm different now, he said against her hair, his words barely audible. Prison changes you. I don't know if I'm the same person you fell in love with. Then I'll fall in love with who you are now, Zara replied, pulling back to look into his eyes. eyes that had seen too much but still held the spark she remembered. "We'll figure it out together." The trauma lived in his shoulders, the way he flinched at sudden movements, how he positioned himself with his back to walls. But it also lived in his newfound purpose, forged in the crucible of injustice and tempered by the knowledge that his suffering had meaning. David watched the reunion from his car across the street, his own transformation complete. The Supreme Court nomination had been quietly withdrawn, his political capital spent on a fight that had cost him everything and given him something more valuable, his soul. That evening, in the Richardson family's living room, 3 generations sat around the coffee table planning their next move. Marcus's hand found Zara's as they outlined their vision for a foundation dedicated to criminal justice reform. "We can't bring back the years that were stolen," Marcus said, his voice stronger now, steadied by purpose. "But we can make sure it doesn't happen to the next kid." David nodded, understanding that his daughter and the young man beside her represented something he'd almost forgotten in his climb to power. The belief that the system could be changed, one case at a time, one voice at a time. The reckoning had begun, but the real work was just starting. 1 year later, the Richardson family's backyard glowed with string lights and the warmth of voices raised in celebration. Marcus stood beside Zara on the wooden deck, his hand steady as he slipped the engagement ring onto her finger. A simple band that caught the light like a promise kept against impossible odds. The gathering was small but powerful. Dorothy Washington wiped tears from her eyes as her son Jerome, finally home after his sentence was commuted, laughed with Miguel Santos over plates of Elena's famous empanadas. Reverend Sarah Johnson sat with families whose children were still fighting their cases, their presence a reminder that the work was far from over. David raised his glass as the conversations quieted, his voice carrying across the yard with the authority of a man who'd learned the difference between power and purpose. "A year ago, we thought we were fighting for one young man's freedom. What we discovered was that we were fighting for the soul of our justice system." Marcus squeezed Zara's hand, feeling the weight of the moment and the lightness of hope intertwined. They'd announced their foundation earlier that evening, the Williams-Richardson Initiative for Wrongfully Convicted Youth, their love story having evolved into something larger than themselves. "To Marcus and Zara," David continued, his eyes finding his daughters across the crowd, "who taught us that love isn't just about holding each other up, it's about lifting others as you rise." As the applause faded and conversations resumed, Marcus and Zara stepped away from the crowd, their fingers intertwined. Around their wrists, matching bracelets caught the moonlight, each inscribed with names: Jerome Washington, Carlos Martinez, Destiny Johnson. Young people still fighting for justice, still waiting for their own reckoning. Their love had become a movement, their story a blueprint for change. In the distance, the lights of Washington, D.C. twinkled like stars, and for the first time in years, the future felt bright with possibility.